Well, thanks for being with us. My name's Sean Riley. I am the Senior Director for Programs with the American Conservative. Welcome to our 10th annual Foreign Policy Conference. We're excited to have a great lineup for you today and discussing some of the most important and pressing issues facing our country. To introduce the day and to introduce our first panel, I'm going to now turn it over to our Executive Director, Emile Doak. Please welcome Emile Doak.
All right, well, thank you, Sean. We actually have Sean to thank for this. Sean's worked tirelessly over the past few months to put this together. So I'm grateful to him for that. And I also want to thank all of you for joining us here. This is our 10th annual Foreign Policy Conference here at the American Conservative. As you may know, our mission at the American Conservative is to advance what we call a Main Street vision for conservatism. We were founded in 2002 to reignite conversations that we felt conservatives had neglected for far too long, since at least the end of the Cold War. And if you think back to the political environment in 2002, it's probably not surprising that the foreign policy issue was one of those primary conversations that we felt had been neglected. Our magazine was launched in opposition to the Iraq War, and advancing a foreign policy guided by realism and restraint has been a hallmark of our work ever since. Now today, over 20 years later, we're here in the Senate office building, and today's speaker lineup is full of congressmen eager to make the case for a restrained foreign policy that puts American interests first. But this wasn't always the case. As I mentioned before, this is our 10th annual conference. Your program says the same thing. And I personally was first part of this annual conference back in 2017. That year we held it across town at George Washington University, and we were honored to welcome the late Congressman Walter Jones to give opening remarks that year. Congressman Jones, as many of you may know, voted in favor of the war in Iraq in 2002, but soon became a fierce opponent of that war and many of our other foreign misadventures. And around the same time as that fourth annual conference in 2017, our magazine featured a piece by Finley Lewis in the November-December 2017 issue. And in that piece, Congressman Jones spoke with tact and relayed a moving narrative about how he changed his mind on foreign policy after he found himself at a funeral for a local Marine back home in North Carolina. He told TAC, "I cried with the widow, and it awakened me to what I had done." As our former editor Bob Mary noted at the time, it was a rare acknowledgement of error from a politician here in Washington. And equally rare at the time was Congressman Jones's realist stance on foreign policy. I think it's easy to forget just how much a neoconservative foreign policy dominated the Republican Party at that time. Indeed, the title of that 2017 piece in TAC was "Congressional Realists Could Caucus in a Phone Booth." And the subtitle was "Meet the Realist 8. They may be scarce, but they're indomitable." Finley Lewis in that piece wrote that the realists, whose default position on questions of foreign policy and national security is one of skepticism about the value of interventions abroad and of respect for privacy at home, quote, "don't have a prayer of prevailing in an up or down vote against the neoconservative wing of the party." Now, many of those 8 realists are no longer in Congress, like Walter Jones and Tennessee's Jimmy Duncan, who addressed the second annual edition of this conference in 2015. But 2 of them have since become leaders in the Senate on issues of foreign policy and national security, and you'll hear from them later today, Senator Mike Lee and Senator Rand Paul. And as the program today suggests, the realist caucus, if you will, is quite a bit bigger than its former phone booth size. And it's beginning to have a real impact on foreign policy votes in Congress. We saw this in action last May in the debate over the proper response to Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There were 57 congressmen then, far more than the 8 realists that we had identified in 2017, who were willing to question whether $40 billion in aid to Ukraine was really in the national interest, especially given national security issues like our own porous border that are much closer to home. So we'll talk a lot more today about the proper realist response to that still ongoing crisis in Ukraine. But of course, that aid bill in May still passed, despite the opposition from those 57 Republicans in the House. And we've subsequently shipped far more aid than that to Ukraine over the course of the past year. So we've got our work to do, but a more recent vote shows that the Restraint caucus, if you will, now has much more than just a prayer of prevailing on an up or down vote. As many of you know, just this past March, the Senate decisively advanced a bill to repeal the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, that Congressman Jones and many others voted for to justify the Iraq War in 2002. So we're winning the argument. And today you'll hear many of the leading voices in Congress who are crafting a foreign policy agenda that fulfills that realist and restrained vision and charts a new course that is guided by American interests first. To open our conference today, I wanted to first take a look back and a more retrospective look at the foreign policy battles of the recent years. That's the topic of our first conversation, which I'll introduce here in just a second. But first, I want to again thank all of you for being here. I want to encourage you to continue to engage with our work at the American Conservative, whether that's through our website, where we post multiple new feature articles and blog posts every day, our podcasts. You'll hear from one of our podcast co-hosts here shortly, our Constitutional Fellows Program for young leaders, and conferences and events like the one that you're attending here today. I also want to encourage you to stop by the check-in table if you haven't already. We have a lot of goodies there for all of you in attendance today, including a copy of our most recent issue of the print magazine that comes out 6 times a year. We have copies of our 20th anniversary anthology book called Main Street Conservatism, The Future of the Right. Those are for sale at a nice little discount for everyone here today. And it also includes a full section on foreign policy if you're interested in reading more about the magazine's history on this issue. And then you'll also notice on your program, if you are not yet a member of the American Conservative, you're not yet reading Without Limits online and receiving the print magazine in your mailbox, there's a special QR code with a special offer for you to join us as a thank you for attending here today. Now, lastly, before I introduce our panel, I want to thank our sponsors who have made today's event possible, most especially the Stand Together Trust, F. Francis and Dion Najafi of the Pivotal Foundation, as well as Vladimir Egger. So with that, I want to invite our first panel to please come up to our tables here, and I will introduce them once they're seated. All right, so for our opening conversation today, a retrospective on restraint in the Trump era. We are pleased to be joined by, furthest to my left, your right, Michael Anton, who is lecturer in politics and research fellow at Hillsdale College's Kirby Center here in Washington, D.C., just around the corner from where we are now. He previously served in national security positions in both the Trump and Bush 43 administrations. And he is also the author of the excellent book, if you haven't read it already, you totally should, The Stakes, America at the Point of No Return. Next to Michael is Dan Caldwell. He is vice president at the Center for Renewing America, another excellent organization. He was formerly vice president for foreign policy at Stand Together and a senior advisor to Concerned Veterans for America. Dan is also a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. And last but not least is my colleague, Micah Meadowcroft. He is our web editor here at the American Conservative. He's also co-host of that podcast that I mentioned, TAC Right Now, which you should all be listening to every week. And before joining us at TAC, Micah served as a White House liaison at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency during the Trump administration. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Micah.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Emile. As Emile said, today's dedicated largely to this Congress and looking forward to the future, but we're beginning with a look back to the past. American foreign policy emerges from, constitutionally speaking, a dance between the president and the Congress. Of course, in practice, there is a third party to those negotiations, the permanent bureaucracy. My interlocutors today are both intimately familiar with this messy three-way dynamic. Parts of Trump's instincts were, of course, successfully carried out during the Trump administration regarding putting America first, and we were all very excited to see the growth that we continue to see in this Congress and look forward to hearing more about this afternoon. But of course, other parts were not, and there were a number of missteps and false starts. And so we want to review some of those today. Dan, working with Congress, why don't we start with you, and what's the dynamic, or what did you see during the Trump years that prevented a true America First foreign policy from being initiated?
Well, thanks, Micah. So I just want to start off with my own little nostalgia about the American Conservative. So 20 years ago, in the lead up to the Iraq War, I remember going to the Barnes & Noble at 90th Street in Shea in Scottsdale, Arizona, and reading the American Conservative and some absolute righteous railings by people like Pat Buchanan and Scott McConnell against the Iraq War, a war that I would later serve in. And I couldn't imagine back then, 20 years later, I'd be speaking at one of their events, and it's a real honor. And you know, quite frankly, I'm proud to be an Iraq War vet, but I wish more people would have listened to the American Conservative, and I wouldn't have that title, nor would anyone else. It's also an honor to be here with Michael Anton. I'll also just say I had a fantastic essay in the recent Claremont Review of Books on George Kennan. You should all check it out. But to answer your question, I think that when you're talking about the Trump administration, whether you're talking about the executive branch or Congress, and you alluded to this, you have to start with an acknowledgement that there was an unprecedented effort by the president's own appointees, the senior leaders of the uniformed military, and the permanent national security bureaucracy to thwart the president's foreign policy agenda. And you saw this all play out through things like Russiagate, the Russian bounty hoax in Afghanistan, which was just a blatant attempt by the intelligence community, the regime media, and members of Congress to stop the president from withdrawing from Afghanistan. You had people like Ambassador Jim Jeffrey outright lying to the president about the number of troops in Syria and then bragging about it. And that was, again, another effort to prevent the president from fulfilling his campaign promises and to withdraw from a war. And in my experience as an outside advocate, I wasn't somebody who served in the administration, but I ran an advocacy group and several major issue campaigns to advance large parts of the president's agenda, both around foreign policy and veterans issues as well, too, giving veterans choice. I had this very strange recurring event where I would be launching a campaign to advance something like giving veterans healthcare freedom or getting out of Afghanistan. And I would get calls from people within the administration, either from the VA, from within the State Department, or even within the White House, asking me to stop running a campaign and trying to advance the president's agenda. I want to be clear, it was not calls like, hey, you guys should use better messaging, or maybe it's a good idea for just strategy's sake that you guys pipe down. It's like, no, could you please stop? I know my boss wants this to happen, but it's, you know, we don't like it. And I saw this first with the Department of Veterans Affairs, where you had the first VA Secretary, David Shulkin, literally urging the major veteran organizations to oppose giving their members healthcare choice. You had the Mike Pompeo State Department trying to block nominations that the president made, including my boss at the time, Will Ruger, who's also a board member of the American Conservative. You had the Pompeo State Department getting to Congress, working with members of Congress and the media, trying to stop foreign aid rescissions that the president wanted, which my current boss, Russ Vogt, who was director of the Office of Management and Budget, was pushing. And again, something very popular, very common sense, that was widely supported. So you repeatedly saw this collusion between these institutions in this town, again and again, stopping the president trying to achieve what he wanted in terms of foreign policy. And Congress played a key role in that. Now, I am somebody who believes that Congress has an important role to play in shaping American foreign policy. It's plain as day in the Constitution. Congress ultimately declares war. And I want to see Congress voting more on whether or not we send our sons and daughters overseas to fight in conflicts. But that wasn't what was happening most of the time in Congress. You did see a bipartisan coalition often come together. Some of the speakers you're going to have later, like Congressman Matt Gaetz, were involved in it. But more often than not, you saw Congress instead looking to avoid those types of votes and instead colluding with people within the president's administration that did not believe what he did on foreign policy and the media, and advance things like the Cheney-Crow Amendment, which was an amendment that was pushed by, I know she has a lot of fans here, Liz Cheney, and Jason Crow, who is an interventionist Democrat from Colorado, to slow down the president's withdrawal from Afghanistan. And what they used was, as a justification for that, was the fake Russian bounty story. So again, you see that collusion. And you also saw when President Trump tried to withdraw from Syria at the end of 2019, Instead of voting up or down on an authorization for that mission, they voted for a resolution, a toothless resolution condemning it. And you had the current House Speaker vote for that, I just point out. And you had the majority Republicans in Congress. So they had a role to play in shaping American foreign policy. They had power to use, but they instead chose to go outside of what the Constitution had Congress, what the Constitution dictated that Congress should do in foreign policy, and collude essentially with the permanent national security bureaucracy, the media, to try and undermine the president. And I don't think you can have a conversation about what was accomplished without first acknowledging that.
Thank you. Michael, since you left the National Security Council in 2018, you've spent the last 5 years, I think one of the questions animating your writing has been, who the hell's actually in charge here, especially in the executive branch? Could you speak to your year at the NSC in the Trump administration? What did you see, and then what have you observed since then about how American foreign policy is actually made, and what we can do to change it?
It's made largely, I think, on autopilot, and I'm trying to figure this out. I've got arguments with smarter friends who think my answer is wrong, so I'm going to leave this open to future revision. But the way it looks to me now is no one's in charge, but a doctrine or a set of ideas is in charge that has no central author, that everyone just sort of knows the script, and they don't need to be told. The analogy I like to use is we've all seen a huge flock of birds all flying in one direction, and they all change direction at exactly the same time, amazingly, and go in a 90-degree angle. And there's no radio connecting each bird brain to the other bird brains. They just somehow know how to do it. And that's how foreign policy is made in Washington. You just know what you're supposed to be for, if you're, what your role is. So if you're a military officer, you know what the broader policy is, you know what you're supposed to do. If you're a desk officer at the State Department, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there are constitutional powers and enumerated powers, Article 2 powers for the executive. And by the way, just as an aside, I want to say, if you really want Congress to exercise its role, which I do, but leaving aside the declaration of war, I agree. I'd love to see them do that again, although only in the abstract sense. That is to say, I don't want them to declare war because I don't want to go to war. But they ought to at least exercise that enumerated power over whether or not we do. But if you really want to see them assert their power over foreign policy, they need to use their power of the purse and stop funding the federal bureaucracy for things they don't want it to do. And they're terrified of doing that, and they won't do it. So, Congress, you actually have power. It's there. I can show you the passages because I have to teach this to undergraduates, exactly where it says you get to do these things. Just assert it and see what happens. But they never want to do that. Anyway, the problems of the Trump administration actually started before the Trump administration in the summer of 2016 when some neocons organized these letters. People have actually forgotten this. I had to explain this a number of times recently. It's not that long ago. There was one, and I think there were two. There were at least two, let me put it that way, which had in total, I think the first one had about 150 signatories, the next one had 75, 80. So the way it works in Washington is, in foreign policy, really all government positions, is when an administration comes in and it needs to make appointments, it just starts appointing the people who served in the last administration of that party. But you get if you make the cut, you get a bump up. So if you were an assistant secretary 8 years ago, a new administration comes in, you get to be an undersecretary. Or you just remain a lobbyist or a law partner because you're making too much money, or the new administration doesn't want you, or whatever. But when you so there's this stable of people in both parties that are just ready and waiting to go back into government. But at least 200 of them, more like 225, 250, had signed letters with their names, not anonymously, saying, I will not work for this administration under any circumstances. So right off the bat, you had this crippling problem of who are you going to find? Which is related to the second problem, is that Trump ran against the Republican establishment on foreign policy. So yes, you can't easily turn to the people from the last Bush administration, which was the W. Bush administration, because those people didn't agree with anything Trump said he wanted to do. So where are you going to find all these people? Now, looking forward, I know we're supposed to look back, but looking forward, if there ever is another Republican administration, I'm on record as saying I don't think there will be, but I'm a doomer, and I'm probably wrong. If there ever is one, this problem will be easier to solve because the bench is larger and deeper. But it was very difficult to do in 2016, 17, until you end up getting a lot of people who shouldn't be there and who believe the doctrine or whatever the set of ideas is that just sort of magically informs foreign policy. And, Mike Flynn was an exception. Mike Flynn did not. He believed in what Trump wanted to do, and he had a lot of experience in the bureaucracy. And, you all know the story of how he got taken out. I mean, you want to talk about criminal prosecutions? I mean, apparently Trump is about to get indicted, maybe on Friday, I don't know. It seems like the special prosecutor is going to indict him for having some ridiculously overclassified material at his home in Mar-a-Lago, which disclosed something unbelievable like what Angela Merkel had for lunch in July 2018. I don't know what it says, but if it's actually, having looked at a lot of classified material, I'm telling you, the chances that this really discloses something super sensitive that would harm the national security of the United States, they're not zero, but they're close. Anyway, somebody in the Obama administration, not in the Obama administration, somebody really close to the president, like, we're talking about a universe of 10 or 12 people max, leaked FISA transcripts on Mike Flynn's telephone conversations in December and January of 2016, 2017. That's a really serious super felony, okay? Never been investigated. Nobody's ever been charged. Nobody's ever going to be charged. And Flynn was drummed out of the administration in 24 days. So one of the few people that the president had who understood his agenda and was going to try to faithfully implement it, they fixed on and got rid of quickly, right? And then when you don't have anybody in there trying to kind of fight the miasma of what the blob is, one of the few times I'm going to quote Ben Rhodes approvingly, wants, right? You can't. It's really all but impossible to do. And that was the major. Now, Trump was getting a handle on that as the administration went through, and by the last year, I think the president and everyone around him realized the depth of the problem and were really working to change things. And had there been a second term, I think you would have seen a vastly different second term. You would have seen personnel-wise a vastly different second term. But that does lead me, I'll just make this point and then stop, is, even with that said, I think Trump was more or less faithful to the policies that he ran on in 2016 during his first term. The major exception is that he didn't withdraw from Afghanistan. And yes, he didn't because everyone around him was against it. But in the end of the day, he personally could have said, I've heard you, I've listened to every argument you've made, I've carefully considered it, I believe they were all made in good faith, et cetera, nonetheless. Given these other reasons, we're getting out. I'm giving you a direct order, you must follow it. He never did that in 4 years. And in a way, I mean, that was his decision not to make that decision. But when Biden gave the order in August of 2021, which the national security bureaucracy didn't want to hear, didn't want to implement, they were finally cornered and had no choice but to implement the order. I personally believe, this is the conspiracy theorist in me, that they implemented it as badly as possible in a fit of pique in order to make him look bad and to show him the error of his ways, or so they thought. Like, oh, you want me to clean my room? Well, I'll clean it by burning it down or something. It was kind of there. But, mostly Trump didn't run on being a complete non-interventionist, or to use a bad word from former ages, an isolationist. He told you where he was going to be interventionist and where he wasn't, and I think he mostly stuck to that.
Dan, do you want to add to that?
I think, Michael, your point on what happened with Afghanistan with Biden, I think is the right one. I do think that it's worth noting that the people that ultimately executed the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the people that were responsible, so General Milley isn't technically in the chain of command, but he still is in charge of planning. People like General McKenzie, they were all the people in the Trump administration who were trying to stop withdrawal as they fought him tooth and nail. There is actually evidence that Axios did a report on this, that General Milley was colluding with the Afghan government to stop President Trump from withdrawing in December. And again, I would throw out there that had the withdrawal in December or January of 2020 and then 2021 happened, it would have been less chaotic because it occurred in the winter. The Taliban would have been at home or in their resting areas and wouldn't have been prepared to launch a rapid counteroffensive. I think the end result would have been the same, but it would have maybe been a little less chaotic. One thing that I would just foot stomp as well too is your point about General Flynn. And I think that, I know that you're pessimistic about the possibility of another Republican administration, But if we do have that opportunity, and it is with a president that ultimately wants to fundamentally change American foreign policy, it is, before you can do that, you absolutely have to bring the national security bureaucracy to heel so that something like that doesn't happen and that they aren't fighting you every day. So in the lead up to that, we're talking about Congress, and you brought up appropriations. I'm glad you did. Our group was opposed to the recent debt limit deal because we think it actually undermines the appropriations process. We hope that we can get back to that, but there is an opportunity for this Republican Congress to use that process to at least start to bring them to heel. And then on day one, we have the plans ready to go so that we can do what we can to be in check. And again, I know that you're a doomer on this, but
I have 3 very simple fixes for the national security bureaucracy. Very simple and actually doable and within reach, potentially. Okay, you're not going to reform the State Department, the Foreign Service. I mean, maybe over the long terms, over generations. It reminds me of one of these. I like quoting this line. It was from a review of a book by Tom Wolfe. I love Tom Wolfe. And the reviewer, whose name I forgot, said, Tom Wolfe, one of his great ambitions was to set out to reform the New York literary establishment. He did not succeed, but that's like trying to bring democracy to Russia, okay? Reforming the State Department, the Foreign Service, et cetera, all these places, that's like trying to bring democracy to Russia. If you set that as your goal, right, you're not gonna do it within 4 years. However, here's what you can do very, very quickly. Number one, the people who have the most direct control, even though it's technically indirect, but really is direct and work directly for the president, are the National Security Council staff. They're in the White House with him. They report directly to him in the chain of command. They see him more than anybody else. They travel with him and so on and so forth. Because of dumb budgetary reasons, the National Security Council staff is, I don't know what it is now, but when I left, it was still about 85% detailees. That means people that come from other agencies of the government are sent over to the White House. They remain loyal to that agency of the government, wherever they're from, and to the Borg way of thinking about foreign policy. So you have 85% of this organization that's inside the White House that's supposed to be loyal to the president implementing his agenda, wanting to do something else. So Republicans are always aghast and appalled at the idea of spending money. Properly, I get that, but they can be myopic on this point. Here's one place where you're going to need to spend some money, and it's not that much. I'm talking about maybe $200 million. In federal budgetary terms, it's couch cushion change. Give the National Security Council staff, the budget, enough money so the president can hire people and not be forced to rely on detailees, okay? Section 2, all of those people have to have a top secret SCI security clearance, and the security clearance has been weaponized as a way to keep out staff members that you don't want. I experienced, not personally, but I experienced this myself, where we had good people turned away because they would not be cleared. Another way you do it is your full field background investigation. Well, if we like the guy, we'll get it done in a couple of weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months. If we don't, it could be 18 months, who knows, right? And then the seat's unfilled, okay? Again, this is gonna take a little bit of money, not much less than 200 million. Give the NSC security office is run by detailees. Let it hire its own team of 10 or 12 investigators. They do all the investigations. That means no putting it at the bottom of the pile if you don't want to get this guy cleared. All they do is focus on NSC staff who are personally chosen by the president as national security advisor. And so that the speed, they're dedicated to it and they have his best interests at heart. And then number 3, real simple thing, right? It shows you how gamey Washington really is. The very tail end of the Obama administration, he wrote a letter. I'm not sure what the legal status of this is. I've never been able to figure that out, but it's not a law. I know that. It's not a statute. Basically saying that the director of the Central Intelligence Agency shall have the authority to approve or reject anyone's SCI. In other words, you could get a full field background check all the way up to top secret, but if you don't get that little /SCI after it, you can't work in the NSC staff. And that power resides with the front office of the CIA, who can just look at a name and go, Joe Smith, oh, he's a bad guy. He was against this or that, no SCI. And they'll come up with a reason. They're not going to say it's because he's a bad guy. It's going to be, he left something out on his desk once overnight in a skiff with the door locked, but nevertheless, it was a violation and therefore he can't have it, right? Take that power back. Just take it away. Don't let the CIA have that power over your personal staff. You do all 3 of these things, you can have a staff of 200 or 300 people inside the White House completely loyal to the president and his agenda, and then those people will be a force to be reckoned with by the rest of the bureaucracy that will want to fight with them, as opposed to being essentially spies and enablers of the bureaucracy within the White House, which is what we have now.
So To continue that personnel problem story, Dan, would you tell a little bit about the Will Ruger confirmation fight?
Yeah, so Will Ruger, who at the time was my boss at Stand Together, was nominated by President Trump to be ambassador to Afghanistan. Will was a prominent advocate of withdrawing from Afghanistan and really a prominent advocate of pursuing a more realist foreign policy. And because the president had wisely made some changes in the presidential personnel office in the last year of his administration, you had people like Johnny McEntee going out and actually finding people who wanted to ultimately pursue a foreign policy more in line with what the president wanted. And so they wanted to go ahead and nominate Will to be ambassador to Afghanistan. They made this decision in the early months of COVID, and it was very clear this is what the president wanted. It had been signed off, and almost right away you saw the Pompeo State Department dragging feet. You had people from Mike Pompeo's office trying to stir up opposition in Congress. We can't confirm this, but we think that there were people that leaked out news of his nomination early to try and undermine it. And then when the nomination was formally made and transmitted to Congress, you saw the bureaucracy kick into action. So there was delay in getting paperwork to Congress. They're getting all the things they needed for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to start holding hearings and to get the process going. So ultimately, there wasn't even a hearing on Will's nomination. The same applied to several other ambassadorships and key national security positions like Colonel Douglas McGregor. His nomination to Germany was held up. And again, you saw this with the Pompeo State Department. And I think that he is I don't use this term lightly, he was a particularly villainous figure in the last couple of years of the Trump administration, really maybe all 4 years, in regards to foreign policy. I mentioned the story about what he did around rescissions, where he was working with members of Congress like Senator Lindsey Graham and Hal Rogers to stir that up, and outside groups as well too. You actually may have seen some of them walking around today. They're lobbying Congress for more foreign aid, the United States Global Leadership Coalition. So again, the Trump administration does deserve some blame for not pushing through these things earlier and taking more decisive action on these things. But it's another example about how these personnel processes were weaponized. Now, Will had a clearance. He is still a Naval Reserves intelligence officer, so he didn't have to go through that process again. He had experience overseas, but there was that effort, not just by the Pompeo political appointees, but the bureaucracy within the State Department to slow this down. And just real quick, one experience I had with Will prior to Will being nominated that really sticks out in my brain, that I think hammers home how hostile a lot of people within the president's own White House were to his foreign policy views, is that in 2019, we were asked to have a meeting in the National Security Council with their outreach team. And so myself and Will and another colleague of mine at the time, we met in and we met with two people from the National Security Council. And these are people that normally will meet with groups like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, all the blobby think tanks downtown. And they asked Will, what do you guys believe in? What are your key issues? And we walked through them all. And at the end of the meeting, there's a smirk on this one guy's face who I won't name. And he said, just, no joking in his voice. He says, you guys agree more with that guy over there pointing over to the White House here in the executive office building than we do. And you should have seen, I wish I were recorded it because you should have seen the look on Will's face. It's like everything that he knew was true was just confirmed in that moment. And it was truly an incredible experience to me. And fortunately, most of those people were fired in the coming months because they were Bolton people, but still, that just was a constant issue that I ran into in trying to work with the administration from the outside and advance those priorities.
From a public discourse perspective, probably the biggest shift on foreign policy during the Trump administration is China. Everyone is now willing to talk about China, and and they know they have to. They know that the electorate wants them to. And now, of course, there's a lot of jockeying for position to decide who's the most China hawkish in the right way, whether we're using terms like decoupling or cooperative disentanglement or advocating for an actual conflict over, say, Taiwan. How did that change in conversation happen, and where do you two, now speaking less from perhaps your experience and more from your own reflections on these issues, where do you two see the conversation going within the ongoing Republican fight over its own identity as a party?
Well, the cynical answer to the question of how did it change, I'm not sure I believe, but I will state it anyway. Because there was a sudden turn where the ruling class, which had been pro-economic integration with China pretty much across the board since, I don't know, 1979, by the middle of Trump's term had said, we're done. Not only are we done with that, now it's time for a major confrontation with China. So the cynical explanation goes something like, we've gotten all we can economically out of the Chinese. The labor costs are now so high that you don't actually save money by outsourcing there much anymore. The grand dreams of getting into the massive, 1.3 billion person Chinese market and making your money over there is never going to happen because they're too protectionist and they won't let us in. So there's nothing further to be gained by further economic integration. And, the Russia thing isn't working out that much because even if they're terrible, they're just not that strong. So we need a new boogeyman to scare the hell out of everyone and justify what we're doing, and let's make it China. Most of the reason that I don't believe that necessarily is because it gives too much credit to perspicacity and foresight in a ruling class that I don't find much evidence has that has either. It is true, though, that the conversation changed dramatically, and I think that's about half good and half bad. The half good part that is encouraging, but was only really working well when Trump was around and in office, and he was quite clear on this, is the confrontation with China needs to be an economic confrontation, that even if companies from their own self-interests, outsource less and depend on them less for supply chains and so on, there's still a ton of product dumping, intellectual property theft, industrial espionage, all these kinds of things are going on that we are not sufficiently fighting against, and we need to have that confrontation and win on those terms. What Donald Trump, I think, was pretty supremely uninterested in during his time was war with China over Taiwan or over anything else. And this obviously irritated a lot of his critics and irritates them to this day. And, I've been called an appeaser, literally an appeaser, simply for pointing out that the Chinese can sink a U.S. aircraft carrier if they really wanted to get into it in the Taiwan Strait. They could sink a U.S. aircraft carrier. Now, the Gerald R. Ford, I think, at the end of the day, cost about $15 billion. When you have the wing, typically 4 squadrons, whether they're F Super Hornets or F-35s on board, you're looking at something like $20 billion, and let's say 6,000 guys, 5,500 minimum. That's a pretty big loss to take, right? And the American people have not suffered such a loss since 1942. And a greatly smaller amount of money, adjusted for inflation and plus people, and they were in a gigantic war that an adversary clearly started. I just pointed this out. Are we really ready for something like that over something that, let's face it, is a much more of a vital interest to China than it is to us? It's not to say that Taiwan is irrelevant to the United States, or that I would just gladly, give as if it were ours to give Taiwan to the Chinese. But if you're looking just at the world as a chessboard long term, the Chinese position in terms of retaking Taiwan is a heck of a lot stronger over the decades or centuries than anyone else's position is in preserving Taiwan from a Chinese takeover if they want to do it for simple reasons of proximity, military balance, all kinds of things, and how much the ruling class of each nation and the relative populations of each nation cares about it. So I point these things out just to wonder, if the anti-Chinese rhetoric continues to be more security and less economic, where does that? It could end up leading us somewhere really dumb that I wonder if anybody actually intends. Do they just think it's kind of valuable to talk about a war with China, maybe potentially, and to look tough and not sound like an appeaser? Or do they actually want to do it? My sense is it's more the former, but you often end up with the latter when you're not careful how you behave and how you talk on the world stage.
I just quickly add that I, on the record saying that I think, China is our primary national security challenge. It is a real competitor, and it does pose real threats to us. But I agree with Michael that it is primarily an economic challenge, and that a military conflict would be disastrous. And Michael did a very good job of laying out the costs of what it'd be like to sink an American aircraft carrier. I'd also point out, too, is that adopting a Cold War mindset with China, I think, would have a lot of negative implications back here at home. My former colleague, Reed Smith, wrote a great paper about this in Foreign Policy I encourage you to read. But I think it could be used by the permanent national security bureaucracy that we've just discussed as another reason to do things like expand surveillance powers. Now the FBI needs millions, if not billions of more dollars to fight Chinese espionage, which, don't get me wrong, is a real risk. But just like we saw after 9/11, they would inflate that and use it as an excuse to gain more power. I'd also just finally say, too, I don't actually believe that a lot of the China hawks around town, there are some people that have really thought about this problem in I think, a very thorough and thoughtful way, people like Bridge Colby. But there are others that are China hawks because they actually want to use China as an excuse to keep doing things in other areas of the world, like the Middle East. Like, we can't pull out of the Middle East or China will come in, which in my opinion would be awesome. Have fun in Iraq and Syria. We have to defeat Putin in Ukraine because it sends a message to China. We have to, I've literally heard people argue that we need to be more involved in Moldova, because China could get a foothold there. So, but when you actually press them on what should we be doing in the Pacific and what should we be doing economically to deal with this issue, they have literally nothing in most cases. So that's kind of my broader thoughts about China. I just caution everybody here that it's not an easy issue. It's not a straightforward issue. And I think that a lot of people in the national security establishment, whether in government or Northwest DC, their brains are still so much built to think about the Middle East and Europe that they don't have incentives to think about China in a thoughtful way, and I think that's very scary for a lot of reasons.
By the way, I just want to clarify one little thing. My friend Jim Hansen is here in the audience. He disagrees with me about Taiwan and has written about it. I hope he does not believe it. None of you should believe that when I said I had been called an appeaser, I was referring to him. He didn't do that. It was Michael Pillsbury who called me an appeaser at the second NatCon. It's on YouTube if you want to watch it.
In the lead up to and first weeks of Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, a lot of effort was put into forgetting a lot of history and making sure that the American public was completely unaware of even very recent history, right? 2014 and the Maidan Revolution, et cetera. There was a pause. Like, the U.S. foreign policy seemed already fixated on Ukraine specifically, but Russia generally, under the late Obama administration. And there was a pause of sorts, though of course we had the Russia hoax continuing it during the Trump administration. So Michael, would you speak to, where did that pause come from? What was going on?
Yeah,
is this directly continuous?
I don't know exactly what you mean by a pause, because here's another example of, you want to use the word failure? I don't know, but a place where the Trump action didn't match its rhetoric. Now, that is to say, Trump wanted better relations with Russia, and he really didn't want the United States to be doing anything in Ukraine. Okay, to the extent that, but he would get jawboned extensively by European leaders saying, "Why aren't you doing more in Ukraine?" And he would say, "Well, why aren't you doing more in Ukraine? You care about it more than I do, and it's closer to you than it is to me. So, you coming to me and basically lecturing me, it didn't have a lot of a great effect on him." However, when he was pushed to up arms sales and do things, he did it reluctantly. I don't think the people around him, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and others ever really convinced him that this was a wise thing to do, right? They just wore him down, is my gut sense of it, and he did it. And then because of, this was in a way the genius of the Russia hoax, right? Well, let's back up. I mean, the Russia hoax was, I think, partly intended, obviously it was intended to make sure he wasn't president. That didn't work, right? Well, you can't let all that hard work go to waste, so had to use it for something, and they used it to make it completely impossible to do anything that eased U.S.-Russia tensions, because if he did, all he had to do was like shake Putin's hand in Hamburg. I was there for this. And they would completely flip out, right? You're a Russian spy. I mean, literally this happened. So you had this long meeting with Putin in Hamburg. The press made a story about the fact that it was really long. Like, why was he in there for so long? Like, they were talking, they've never met, I don't know. So then later that same night, there's a dinner with all the leaders. This is the G20, I guess. There's 20 leaders there. and they're all seated somewhere, and it's not up to the president where he gets seated. And when the dessert course serves, people start getting up and going around and talking, and Putin apparently got up and he walked over to Trump and, talked to him for a couple of minutes before he sat down and ate his dessert. And the press made this into a scandal. Hidden secret second meeting that the White House refuses to disclose what was said at the second meeting. Like, I don't know, he said, what do you think of the raspberry compote? I mean, people are insane. Anyway, the point was, anything you do to be the slightest bit friendly or just non-confrontational with Russia, we're going to call you a traitor. And that put tremendous pressure on him to keep the sanctions high, to increase the sanctions, to give lethal aid to Ukraine, to close consulates, expel diplomats, many of whom undoubtedly were actually spies under diplomatic cover, there's no doubt about it. But it made his overall intention toward, as he put it himself, getting along with Russia, made that impossible. So when you say pause, I mean, I'm just reluctant to accept that in part because I think had Trump really done what he wanted to do when they came to him in the summer of 2017 and said, we're going to start giving Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, he would have told them no. And he tried to tell them no, and they wore him down. But at the end of the day, that was his call, not something that he would have self-generated from within, but, you get these kinds of jobs, you're going to be put under tremendous pressure by everybody around you. Even though you're the president, you're the only one who is elected, you definitely have the highest stature and status of everyone in the room. It's still hard to maintain, to maintain opposition against this phalanx of people all telling you got to be doing something else.
Do you want to add to that, Dan?
Yeah, I agree with Michael. Is that I don't there was not a fundamental break with. In terms of actual substance policy with the Russia policy of the Obama administration and the later years of the Bush administration during the 4 years of President Trump. I think the president wanted to do that. And I think the difference was the rhetoric. And that is what freaked out the blob so much. But to say that Trump was, weak on Russia, in large part, the policies were what more hawkish elements of the national security establishment wanted. And that's the reality. So I bring that up in the fact that there's been some implication by some, never Trump neocons, ghouls who, in a righteous country wouldn't, ever be given a magazine column or control of a major publication again. But, here we are. That somehow the weakness of the Trump administration led to this point that we are now in Ukraine. And I think that is just utterly absurd. He gave them Javelin missiles when Obama wouldn't. And he, continued lethal aid and increased it. There was continued training of the Ukrainian military by the United States military. It all was actually ramped up. What I think ultimately that is doing, though, is to distract away from the fact that the Biden administration bears responsibility for what happened in Ukraine. And also, I want to be fair, 30 years of bad post-Cold War foreign policy with NATO expansion, with keeping the open door to Ukraine and so on and so forth. But it was the Biden administration, their mixed messaging, we're not going to put troops on the ground, but we're going to defend European and territorial integrity, that, framing this as this existential fight between democracy and autocracy, which I just have to say is just one of the stupidest things you ever hear. Ukraine, they are a victim of Russian aggression, but let's be honest, they are corrupt, illiberal, increasingly authoritarian state, and they are becoming more authoritarian by the day because that's what happens during extended periods of war. So I just find this conversation about Trump and Russia, if you have it too much, I worry it can cause long-term brain damage. It is that dumb.
I think we have time for one, possibly two questions from the audience. Do we have a microphone for John to pass around? And if you'd like to ask that question, and it better be a question, not a comment. John, don't give up control of the mic.
Over there. Hi, thank you for your remarks. My question is, what do we do about the personnel problem? Because it seems as if one of the issues we have with getting people of a more realist bent into these top-level positions in presidential administrations and so on is that most of the people who know what they're doing and have the credentials for those positions are coming out of these same institutions. I mean, whether we're seeing problems with the military and how far it's gone, or the national security State Department, it seems like there's a difficult path for people to go into these agencies or whatever, and then get into an administration who are actually going to be on the side of that sort of administration.
Well, look, as I said, it's going to be easier if there is another Republican administration than it was the last time, because first of all, there's a number of projects working on this to identify who was good in the Trump administration, who was bad, right? Who should be on this list, who shouldn't be. Other people who maybe weren't in the administration, but who wrote, who spoke, who are on the record. Like, they're just going to be a bench and lists of many, many, many more hundreds of names than there were the first time. So that's point one. Point two is, I think a future administration needs to be a lot less concerned, certainly in positions that don't require Senate confirmation, with credentialing. It's like, well, you don't have quite the resume yet to be X, Y, or Z, and you're too young, right? I'm not saying everybody should be 21 years old in the National Security Council staff, but they're going to need to be a little looser about that than prior administrations have been, because then all you end up with is, an administration that looks like the board of Goldman Sachs or the Harvard Board of Overseers, or as it was, 20 years ago, and that's not that helpful. The deeper problem, which I don't really know the answer to, is it wise to encourage young people to, let's say, go into the Foreign Service, the intelligence community, or the military when things are the way they are? And this is directly personal to me because I'm a college professor, right? So I teach kids, and I teach classes on strategy and national security. And every semester, at least one, sometimes two, will come, three or more will say, wow, that's fascinating. I'd like to do that for a living. Like, how did you get into it? What should I do? Maybe I'm going to go into OCS. Maybe I'm going to, see if I can join the clandestine service or take the Foreign Service exam. And on the one hand, it would be good for all of us if we had more people do this and try to rise through the ranks and get that bureaucratic experience and credential themselves. On the other hand, like, do you want it on your conscience that you said to somebody, go join the deep state the way it is now, right? And then he comes back 5 years later, is like, you told me to go in the Foreign Service. Look at me, man. Like, I'd feel bad, right? So, it's, or do we want to just be honest with people? Like, you're going to be making a serious sacrifice, but maybe you're doing it for some greater good. I just don't know where exactly I come down on that, and I pose that as a dilemma. I don't have the answer.
I think Michael covered this pretty well. There are some great talent building efforts going on. I think the Heritage Project 2025 is really off to a good start. And, you're going to see them not, you already have seen them get people involved with this project that, let's be honest, maybe 5-6 years ago under different Heritage leadership would not have been involved on the national security front. So that's heartening. There is now, I think, a true counter elite in American foreign policy. You have a lot of new institutions like Defense Priorities, like the Quincy Institute. You now have serious restrainers at organizations like the Carnegie Gown and Stimson Center. And there are more and more of these people that are in the national conversation. And you also have more people who are identified and in many ways credentialed to serve in these roles. I would just add, and Michael actually touched on some of these earlier, is that you also need to get the clearance process under control. I think Michael had a great idea there. You also need to get the classification issue. We at Center for Renewing America released a paper earlier this year about how to reform that so that information can be shared more easily between different groups of people within administration. Then finally, you need reforms like Schedule F that you can get these policy-making positions across the permanent bureaucracy in a place where a president can actually appoint people to a policymaking position. And regardless of what some people in the mainstream media would say, this isn't about like making everybody an at-will employee across the federal government so that you can appoint everybody from a forest firefighter in Montana all the way up to Secretary of Defense. This is a reform at specific positions that create policy which should be appointed by elected representatives of the American people.
I would just add one other little thing, which is we need Congress, if they are willing and able and so on, they need to use their statutory power to reduce the number of positions in the federal government that require Senate confirmation. This has been done in the past, okay? In the first term of George, and this is the only time I'm aware of, but I'm sure it's also been done at other times, of George W. Bush, they actually pulled back some requirements of Senate confirmation of certain assistant secretaryships throughout the government. Obviously, every secretary should be Senate confirmed. Every deputy should be Senate confirmed. Unders, I suppose. Does every single assistant secretary, all of these positions, I think a lot, now the Senate doesn't want to give this up because it's power. We can put unrelated holds on person X, Y, or Z until I get what I want from this administration over there, right? But if we ever have united government again, this should be high on the agenda, because leaving aside every other problem that we've talked about, who's that guy at Brookings, Paul Light, who writes at the beginning of every new administration, he writes about how it takes longer and longer and longer, right? It used to take a couple of months, then 6 months, now it's like a year. We're going to be at a point where, as a first term is coming to an end, right, there are still open positions that have had nominees for 3 or 4 years that the Senate hasn't acted on, and it's ridiculous. And this is something that Congress, if it wanted to, could help fix.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Michael.